Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, both in person and via the live stream. My name is Katharina Opser, and I'm the Democracy Program Director of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation's Washington, D.C. office. I'm just going to start with a couple of housekeeping notes. Restrooms are downstairs if you need them. This event is offering interpretation between German and English, so for anyone who needs interpretation, please go get a headset over here from one of our colleagues, and they'll tell you which channel to click to for either language. After the discussion, we will have a Q&A session, a question and answer session, and following that, we will have a reception, so please do join us for that at the conclusion of the event. Given that I'm based in DC, I am particularly delighted to get to welcome and join you here tonight and introduce tonight's conversation, Reporting on the Far Right. This is the second event of Bard College Berlin's and the Foundation's fall series, which is entitled Writing Democracy, Stories, Ideas, and Arguments on and Off the Page. Each of our events aims to shed light and give depth to critical topics that are interlinked with democracy through conversations with prominent writers and journalists on both sides of the Atlantic. What we're hoping to do is to go beyond the daily headlines and explore deeper questions of politics and society in the United States and Europe, the lessons of history, misconceptions in our society, and the role of democratic values. And in doing so, we hope not just to deepen the understanding of these critical issues, but also to strengthen ties on both sides of the Atlantic. We will be back in Berlin one more time on November 11th at the Publix event space, where Josh will be in conversation with his New Yorker colleague, journalist Andrew Marantz, on the erosion of democracy and rise of hybrid regimes, so please join us there as well. And now I would like to turn it over to our esteemed panel, moderated by Josh. Joshua Jaffa is the inaugural writer in residence at Bard College Berlin, the partners on this project. He is also contributing writer at The New Yorker and the author of Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia, which won the Orwell Prize in 2021. Again, thank you so much to our panel and to our audience for joining us tonight. Josh, over to you.
This is already on, I presume? Good. Thanks, Katharina, for the nice welcome introduction. Thanks to the Böll Foundation for hosting us and for partnering with Bard College Berlin on this series, which has been interesting so far, and I'm sure tonight will absolutely continue that trend. I want to briefly introduce my panelists for this evening. Holger Stark on the end here is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Die Zeit and runs the investigative unit there. Before that, he spent 16 years with Der Spiegel, many of which were in Washington, right? How many? 4, okay. Where he worked on a number of prominent stories and investigations, from WikiLeaks to Nord Stream sabotage. He's the recipient of multiple journalistic prizes, the Nannen Award, Reporter Prize, and was elected Germany's Reporter, a Journalist of the Year, and is the author of several books relevant for our purposes or topic tonight. It's one on the so-called New Right, and is currently working, I heard, in fact, maybe just finished, at least the manuscript, on a book about Germany's pained, difficult relationship with the United States. Immediately to my left, friend and colleague Elisabeth Zerofsky, contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. For that publication, also for the New Yorker, she's written an illuminating series of pieces on the rise of illiberalism and the contours of both the right and left in places like Hungary, Poland, France, and Germany. And she is currently working on a book about exactly those subjects, the rise of far-right politics, ideology, new era of illiberal democracy in both Europe and the United States. So thanks to you both for being here tonight. I want to start with, yes, indeed, round of applause. A basic, I hope not naive or pretentious, but a kind of definition-setting question about the nature of what it is you do, we do, the point of journalism in this age. And, you know, I think of two potentially conflicting, though maybe you tell me they're not. They're actually somehow work, they augment or buttress each other. But on the one hand, I think of a journalism that is meant to create a shared sense of empathy, understanding, make readers see that people, unlike themselves, might actually have more similarities than differences, to understand other human beings as they themselves understand their lives, their views, ideologies, and so on, to kind of validate, in a way, their experience. Another impulse is to be kind of fact-checking, accountability, truth-tellers, right? To say, no, black is black, white is white, and so on. This is true, this is not true. And what happens when those impulses, are they in conflict? How in your own work have they been in conflict? And what ultimately is the point of the journalism you do? Which of those impulses do you favor? Let's start with Holger.
Yes, thank you very much, Josh, and it's a pleasure being here. So for me, journalism, probably the most important aspect of journalism is the role as a watchdog. As a watchdog in a society where in democracy you investigate things, you find out how politicians, how leaders of big companies and others are behaving, and if they behave in the wrong way, if they collude with the law or with the ethical guidelines that a society has. You write about that, and the society is outraged, and there will be consequences. Holding the powerful accountable, that's an old-fashioned understanding of journalism that I very much like, because I think this is crucial in a democracy. This is why I'm active in investigative journalism since a very long time. And my deep concern is that we're getting closer and closer to a moment where this role doesn't work anymore, because societies are not willing any longer to accept what a scandal is and what's not a scandal. So having this common sense of what's right and what's wrong in our modern societies, that's something that we're in the process of losing. I think we can see in the United States how far that process can evolve. We're not yet there in Europe. We're not that there in Germany, but we definitely are moving toward that tendency, and that gives me a great sense of concern.
Elisabeth?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I also have what I think is kind of an old-fashioned and in some ways more simplistic understanding of what journalism is and what my role is as a journalist, and that is just to inform the public, and that involves some judgment calls on my part as a journalist. And so my job is to sort of go out there and talk to people and do all sorts of research and to learn things and to understand things, and then to think to myself, okay, it's important for my readers and knowing who my audience is to know the things that I've learned, and I think that actually kind of in some ways resolves the paradox that you just brought up, because then on the one hand, it's both my job to, if a politician is out there making stuff up, as happens often these days, then it is my job to inform the public that actually this is wrong. And I think we are seeing, as Holger mentioned, that those efforts to inform the public of things that are being said that are wrong are increasingly, under strain and difficult. And then on the flip side, the other thing that you mentioned is that it's also my job to, if there are people out there who are making decisions that others don't understand, or actions or behaviors that others don't understand, it's also my job to inform, or to try to inform why that is, and to convey some kind of understanding. And I think, at its base, that is a very at the risk of sounding, high-minded, that is a very sort of democratic activity, is that people need to be informed in order to make decisions about the societies they live in and how we should live together.
So then let's interrogate both of you, or ask both of you to think about this distinction, if it matters, between kind of politicians, leaders, people who have some either influence over a movement or a party, or hold actual political office, which is kind of real hard power, let's say, in a political sense, and supporters, people who vote for these parties or are sympathetic to them, who aren't involved in politics in a formal way, but kind of are the fuel that makes these movements possible. Do you think when you're kind of in conversation with one versus the other, you think about that differently? Are you more, I guess, from listening to Holger, kind of aggressive, looking to play this accountability role when it's someone who holds this kind of objective, hard political power in some way, but you enter into a different mode when it's someone who just may have voted once, perhaps in a crucial election for these people, and you want to understand why? I mean, how do those two, do you engage in different journalistic modes, and could you describe them?
My criteria is the level of power that someone is holding. So the more power someone has, the more accountable he or she is, and the tougher the rules of our approach and our judgment are. It requires a totally different style of reporting when you look who voted for a certain party, or if you try to get an understanding of the mood in a certain part of the country or so. But if you speak with the powerful people, then you really track them.
Yeah, I would basically pretty much agree with that. I think somebody who is a public figure or a public official, there's an expectation that that their speech should be held to certain standards, that we should have the right to interrogate them and to debate and criticize and question them in public forums, in all sorts of ways, and that there's a kind of assumption that there's an understanding of how that ecosystem works with the media and with politics and that kind of thing. And I think when I'm reporting about private citizens or people who are not in the public sphere, that's a very, very different approach, because a lot of times people aren't familiar with how, not that they're not familiar with how media works, but they're just not accustomed to speaking to the public in a certain way. And I've done this myself, and I've made that mistake, when I was just starting out, when I treated people who didn't have experience talking to, national newspapers, and I subjected their words to the kind of, the kind of harsh examination that I might use for a public figure. And I think that was a mistake. I think that that's not really a reasonable standard to have for somebody who you might run into at a political event and who, is kind enough to speak with you.
So I want to push a little bit on that second category, because for me, I think it's obvious, as Holger said, this kind of spectrum, the more powerful you are, the more rigorous and kind of inflexible, in a way, the journalistic attention that you face. But let's talk about this other category, right? I'm interested, maybe it's just my own journalistic proclivities as both a writer and a reader, in not necessarily the powerful or the ones who hold formal power, but the people who kind of make that power possible in small little ways, but whose most of their lives exist outside of the political arena, at least in a formal sense. And here I want to bring up for discussion, you can tell me how relevant or not this example is, but this story that at the time got a lot of attention from 2017 in the New York Times, shortly after Trump was inaugurated or began his first term as president. And it was about this white nationalist supporter in Ohio. And the piece was written on the eve of his marriage, and it opened actually describing his and his wife's wedding registry. On their list was a muffin pan, a four-drawer dresser, and a pineapple slicer. And this man was described as, quote, the Nazi sympathizer next door, and was described very much in that vein. And the piece was criticized at the time for perhaps, or those who criticized it didn't say perhaps, for overly humanizing someone with not just noxious but kind of dangerous views. This whole idea of kind of, Nazis, they're people too, struck many people as something between naive and potentially journalistic malpractice. I'm quite interested, I'll reveal my own bias here. I actually think that Nazis are people too, and that's actually interesting to push on that and to explore the ways in which they add a pineapple slicer to their wedding registry and so on. But we're in a different era now. Maybe the stakes feel different to you both. Maybe 2017 feels like, in a way, a kind of, a naive, low stakes or low pressure moment compared to the one we face now. But let's explore together this idea of the standards you hold subjects to of this type. Do you want to know about wedding registry of a white nationalist? Does that help understand the movement? Where do we want pieces that humanize such figures, and where do we want pieces that kind of from the very beginning or from the lens, the way that they're framed, look to kind of push and challenge these ideologies? Elisabeth, you seem primed with an answer.
Well, of course I remember that. I remember that article very well, and the backlash to it. And I do think it was, that was a moment of confusion amongst everyone, and adjustment, and the news media just didn't know what they were doing and that sort of thing. But I think that there are a couple of questions there. One is the editorial judgment, right? Like, is this something that's worth doing a story about? This person who doesn't have, who might have these what some of us would consider repulsive ideas, but who lives in a small town somewhere in Ohio or whatever it was, and yes, maybe voted a certain way for Donald Trump or whatever it might be. But is this a story that is going to add something to sort of public knowledge? So I think there's that question, and then if the answer to that is yes, then I think I always remind myself of this phrase that someone said to me once, which is, a journalist is not a stenographer, right? So it's not your job to just copy down what people say and then print it dutifully or whatever. It's your job to provide context. It's your job to provide historical context, context where these ideas coming from. Why does this person have them? What have they done in the past? What have they done in the past? What are the economics? What are the sociological implications? All of these things are actually part of the job of being a journalist. So I think, perhaps we get ourselves into trouble when we report uncritically.
At the same time, if I can allow myself a quick follow-up, I say this really as a reader or consumer of news more than someone involved in its production. I feel like we're now 9 months into Donald Trump's second term as president, and there's still this kind of mystery about, well, why exactly, how did that happen? What were the factors that led to his reelection? What do people see in him? I mean, there's lots of theories and there's lots of different explanations, and we've seen pieces written from all over the country that try and get to the bottom of this, but it still feels like actually a kind of mystery. What were the main drivers? What was going on inside the minds of the tens of or millions or more of people who voted for him? And so I still feel like I don't know enough of just to get to the stage of a kind of critical interrogation of someone's views and why a person holds them. I feel like you first have to establish, well, what exactly is this kind of bouquet of ideas and views, and I still feel like that's somewhat foggy. Or am I being obtuse?
No, I agree that there is still a lot to understand, not only for journalists but for the entire society. But I have my significant doubts if the old-fashioned journalism that many media practiced over decades is capable of grasping what's really happening. And I think there's a wrong understanding, at least in the old days, that journalists could go somewhere and make up their minds and find something that is kind of like almost a mean description of the protagonists, the people that they were meeting. And I mean, you can find with every person something that disqualifies the person. Josh, your shoes, not very polished. So he's sitting here with not polished shoes. What does it say about you? And in the old days, when a journalist was kind of like gatekeeper to information, he or she just went to someone and then wrote something and came up with the sometimes destroying judgment. And I think it's a tempting situation to visit a potential white supremacist in Ohio and just really slam him, describing his home scenario and the surrounding and so on. And I think this is bad journalism. I think we really need to focus on what people are saying, what their beliefs are, and trying to understand why they think this way and why they behave. And this, for me, rules out disqualifying them by like the things that they are wearing, or the habits, or cultural differences, because they're from a rural part of the country, or all that kind of stuff.
So you're an editor of a German paper very much interested in these questions. So tell me, kind of operationalize what you've just said. Explain to me how you send your writers off into the world. With what sort of tasks, with what sort of instructions? How are they meant to do this in practice, what you just described? Let's say explaining the rise of something like in popularity of the AfD.
Well, I mean, there's no one way of like covering the rise of the AfD, but I strictly would cut out all segments that really focus on the individual way of like portraying people in a personal way, and I always encourage my staff writers focusing on the political level. So what I want to know, for example, we ran a profile about Gloria von Thurn-Taxis, a really rich and famous go-in-between between the very arch-conservative movement and the far right. And I don't want to know only how she sits there and drinks her tea. This is also interesting, but that's not mainly relevant. I want to know in which conferences she took part, whom she hosted as a host for fundraising dinners, whom she's connecting with whom, and supporting new affiliations and so on. It's nice to have some additional descriptions, but I really think we in these days. The times are over where you can just portray someone and think people are just believing and buying everything. In these days, people can, in a very smart way, verify what you're writing. What we more and more face is that the people that we are trying to interview say, okay, that's fine, but we do a record as well. So I put out their iPhones and make a recording as well, because we don't trust journalists anymore. And then you need to deal with the situation that they potentially publish the record by themselves. So you need to be extremely accurate. You need to be super precise. You should leave out everything that makes you vulnerable or gives the readers the impression that you just want to diss someone and to slam someone. So I think the standards of how to conduct good journalism really changed over the course of the last 5 to 10 years.
I guess the question I'm asking in different ways is about how you understand a phenomenon without necessarily, while retaining kind of your critical faculties to push and prod and challenge it where appropriate, but to not be, as I understood you saying, Holger, kind of a priori antagonistic, to kind of also let these ideas have some space, just like they have space in the minds of people, right? To not kind of go in looking to be mean, to looking to be adversarial. But then how do you both draw that line, right? Between being kind of retaining your wits about you, as it were, right? But not letting that push you to a place where you're constantly in a state of a kind of adversarial relationship with your subjects, which I think it sounds like we all agree is not productive for the act of journalism.
I think it really depends on whom you're covering. When you cover like ordinary voters, I would be much softer and would come with way more understanding, or the willingness to listen, to understand. Or if you investigate someone who's really like an activist, who's engaged in right-wing networks, who's really trying to make politics. Mm-hmm. As said earlier, in those cases, my approach generally would be much tougher. And I would try to look behind the scene and discover something, portray something that is unknown yet. So it really depends. But in general, if you speak with people and you want to try to get an understanding why they voted for someone, let them speak. So give them room to elaborate on their thinkings.
Yeah.
And
I want to ask you, Elisabeth, a specific follow-up. I hope this doesn't put you too much on the spot, which is just if there happens to be an example from your reporting across Europe and the US of where a conversation of this type surprised you, right? Where you kind of went in thinking you maybe understood, oh, I know what this community is about, or this person. I know what these ideas are, what the mood is here, and something about the actual process of reporting made you understand that, oh, there's something more either interesting happening here or surprising, and you ended up with a understanding and a portrait of a person or a place that was very different than maybe what you had in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that happens all the time, and I like to think that that's a sign of like doing my job well, because obviously you're going to go into a story with your own sort of preconceived ideas about it, but you have to be open to having those preconceived ideas, you know, altered, or to learning something new, that sort of thing. And so I did a story about a right-wing think tank in the United States that used to be kind of traditionally conservative, and over the last 8-10 years at this point, became very hard right, alt-right. They were some of the first kind of, you know, conservative elites to support Trump, and they have this reputation of, you know, being very, I want to try to avoid using certain words in this context, but of being very, very hard right, essentially, and racist and fascist, and they get called these kinds of things all the time. And so I got an assignment to go and write about them, and it was hard to get them to talk to me because, you know, typically these kinds of people, they don't want to talk to the New York Times, and they themselves, they're not voters, but they're not politicians. They're kind of, you know, they're smart people. A lot of them have PhDs. They're political philosophers, that kind of thing. And so I did this story about them, and, you know, I think, so it was mostly positively received with some like very kind of ardent objections to it. And I think one of the objections to it was that I didn't, you know, I sort of described who these people were and what they believed. And I didn't come out after each thing that I stated and say, and this is bad. They think this and this is bad. You know, they want this and this is bad for the country. And I didn't do that because I'm not allowed to do that as a reporter. And I don't think that's my, you know, that's not my job. And also, you know, they did agree to talk to me, and so I have to, you know, lend them some kind of, you know, respect to a certain extent. But I also think in that situation, it's like, okay, what do you as my audience, do you want me to come out and tell you like this stuff is bad? Or do you want to understand what it is that these people are saying that is getting 51% of the country to vote for them? I mean, you have to try to understand what is the allure in this if you want to understand what's going on in the country. And if you're not open to that, you know, I think it puts us in a difficult position.
May I add or pick up one point that Elisabeth just made? You were looking for words. No, but there's a great point in that, because I think what also changed is the way of how we use words to describe a political phenomenon. I think it's not helpful any longer to attribute certain terms. Like in Germany, we distinguish between like erzkonservativ, like arch-conservative, rechtsradikal, like radical right, rechtsextrem, right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis, fascists, and there was a time when those words meant something. I think we're beyond that point. I think it doesn't mean anything at all. The words are somehow used and trashed, and I think for many journalists that poses a significant problem, because they're so used to try to pick those words. And for example, in Germany, like a radical right means within the constitution but close to the edge. Rechtsextrem, right-wing extremist, means beyond the constitution. So that's the case for the Verfassungsschutz, for the Interior Intelligence Agency. And in the old days, we really calibrated super precisely which verb we would use and how far we would go. And I think that's probably one of the achievements of the far right, that they use those words so often, or they somehow like turn them, that they basically don't mean anything. So if you would ask me how I would describe the AfD, I would really try to stay away from saying like rechtsradikale party or rechtsextreme party or something like that. And I also think if you look in the US, you probably would check every box when it comes to the definition of fascism, or at least most of the boxes. Is it helpful to call it a fascist situation? I would say no, it's probably not. So I refuse, at least for myself, to use those terms to try to describe a political tendency or political situation, because I think in a way people are numb to those words.
And they've been turned into epithets. They've been turned into insults instead of words that help us to describe or to understand. And so I think that's also, I totally agree. I think that's also where, it's not to say that there isn't ever a place for them. I mean, there is, if that's what we're talking about. But I think they need to be used in a certain context with very clear intention and not just tossed around as they.
You know, I liked your story. I was interested in it, Elisabeth, about this think tank, and it sounded like you arrived at this position, or in fact just wrote the whole piece from this notion of like, these ideas matter. It's worth understanding these ideas because these ideas have obvious political relevance for our society. So you kind of have to deal with them, and just labeling them bad or kind of beyond the pale is kind of civically pointless. Maybe that's a bit of an extreme shorthand of what you said, but anyway, I found that idea of compelling and convincing, and I wonder how both of you think about how to approach the kind of underlying phenomena that give rise to these movements, getting beyond certainly their leaders or activists, people who are pushing a political agenda, but also just a very personal agenda about accumulating power and so on. Even the voters who are kind of talking about this election or that election. In the US case, and in fact maybe US and Germany, US and Europe are similar here when we think of the underlying drivers of why these movements have appeared, the reverberating effects of globalization, deindustrialization, communities, cities segregating, rural, urban, class, profession, people kind of segregating into their own communities and not having a lot of kind of heterodox mixing, the effect of immigration, if not economic, psychic, what that does to certain communities. How do you, and maybe I'll just start with you, Holger, as someone who oversees a newsroom, right? Like, how do you try and explore and explain those phenomenon, which are kind of real, right? The degree to which they, let's say, should, quote unquote, lead to certain political impulses is a question that maybe comes later. But how do you try and understand those phenomenon and treat them seriously, and treat seriously the reaction, feelings of people affected by them, without necessarily saying, and therefore, yes, of course, it's like obvious or correct or inevitable that they might vote for AfD or might become Trump voters and so on. But just like, how do you sort of pause and say, let's explore the way that millions of people's lives have been materially affected by this phenomenon, and that's real and that's happening and we should understand it. What does that look like in practice at Die Zeit?
Well, there was a funny, you could also say hilarious tendency after Trump won in 2016 that every newsroom sent cohorts of reporters in the US to fly over countries, so like to Oklahoma City or Des Moines or somewhere else, to like explore and really try to understand what the ordinary people from the rural part of the country are thinking. In Germany, there was a similar tendency to send people to like North Rhine-Westphalia in the old deindustrialized regions, and really like writing long features about how the people feel there. I think that's at best a little bit of helpful and not very much.
Why?
Because the hope that a reporter from Berlin or from Hamburg who is traveling for a week to a deindustrialized city in North Rhine-Westphalia speaks to a dozen of people there and then writes really a well-reflected feature, I think that just doesn't work. And this is this kind of like almost kind of arrogant
but what is the solution?
approach.
I agree, or rather I'm convinced in all the ways that approach can be problematic or less than ideal, or delivers a result that's not as deep, rich, nuanced as you might wish. But is it better to just not even attempt those kinds of projects, right?
No, it's better
what's the solution?
It's it's better to open an office and to send a correspondent who's on a day-to-day basis talking to the people, and then really tries to get the stories and to understand the problems, and not try to it's like, come on, let's fly. Let's go to Syria and look like the new regime looks like. You have 1 week, so you pick like 2 or 3 aspects, and then you write a story, and you probably don't get how the country is evolving. So we, for example, have an office in Leipzig, which is for the weekly edition, running 3 pages every week, and those stories are much better than the stories that a correspondent who's flying in and flying out can produce. What we also did is we invented like 4 years ago or so. A format which is also not really like super creative, but still for us very productive. It's called Streit, like debate. So every week we find 2 people, bring them together, and we moderate the session, and they like exchange arguments. The only condition is do it in a civilized way. So we try to identify one main topic of division in German societies, and bring together two antagonists, but we want them to be like constructive and to argue. So that lays out at least different arguments from different sides, and afterwards, hopefully, as a reader, you have the chance to come to an own conclusion, to an own judgment. You may call that helpless as a format, but it surprisingly it works really well, and our readers love it. And I think and that's an explicit countermeasure against polarization and the tendency that we see, especially in the United States, that certain media only feed their own bubble, and compromise or constructive approach isn't what people want, but people want like slamming the other side. And in a way, I refuse to feed that narrative, or we refuse to feed that.
I would just add that I think, especially in the States, I think there's this tendency to want to say, like, what is the reason for Trump? And to come up with an answer for that, right? Oh, it's because people are racist. For a long time, there's been this debate. Is it because people are racist, or is it because of economics? Which is it? Some people say it's racism. Some people say it's economics. And I think, like, what gets lost is that when you have such a political upheaval like this, and I'm not a historian, but you can easily glean this from, reading about other periods of upheaval, whether it's in the 1930s or the late 18th century, whatever. I mean, it's a lot of different individual, complicated social forces that come together to create such a political and social upheaval like this. And so I think, part of, I'm not an editor and I don't work in a newsroom, but part of my own approach is to kind of try to, to sort them out, and to just, if you're going to work on a story, okay, what is it about this, what is it about, the cultural change among this particular class of people in this particular place over the last 40 years? Because a lot of times these questions, we also have, we also treat them very myopically. It's like, oh, okay, there was a financial crisis in 2008, and then, 8 years later, Trump was elected. Well, no, a lot of times journalists have a kind of poor understanding of history, like myself included, but these are actually changes that have been happening for decades, back to the 90s, or back to even to the 60s and 70s. And so I think it's a question of also, instead of trying to say, like, okay, I'm going to try to explain the Trump phenomenon to you. It's like, okay, what are the different sort of, what's motivating this group of people? What's motivating this group of people? What's motivating, financiers who live in Greenwich, Connecticut versus, Latino men who are on the, like, these are very different stories. And I think it's important to kind of try to tease them out and not to look for that easy explanation.
Can you tell us an example of how you did that, and whether it's in Poland with a pocket that sort of went in some interesting or dramatic way for law and justice, Germany with AfD, US, MAGA, like a place where you arrived and by engaging in the full spectrum of history of the place and this many types of contexts, economic, social, historical, and so on, like there's something you came to feel like you understood, oh, I see how this happened here, at least, right? Not extrapolating across the country or, like, let alone across the West writ large. Those are questions that I agree are kind of too difficult or just not the ones for journalism to answer. Journalism, I think, is better at explaining like why did this either individual arrive at these views, maybe maximum why did this kind of community arrive at these views. But is there a place that after spending some time in you felt like, oh, that like the act of journalism really did help me understand what happened here?
Well, this is a little bit of a cheat because this is what my book work is essentially. So it's not just one article that I'm writing, but it's like an extensive period of time that I am spending on trying to understand like different groups of people and what has turned them into far-right voters for different reasons. But I can tell you, in my work in doing that, for example, I'm writing about the northeast industrial basin of France, which is, as in many places, as in Germany, as in flyover country in the United States, was formerly the industrial part of the country, and then slowly the industry died out. And it used to be in France. It used to be many of the people there, working class voters. They voted for the French Communist Party actually because they were left-wing voters, and now they're far-right voters. And you look at that and you think, okay, how on earth did this happen, right? How did they go from being Communist Party voters to being National Front or National Rally in France voters? And of course, this is a pattern that we're seeing. I don't want to oversimplify, but this is a pattern that we're seeing in former Union areas of the United States. Germany is like a little bit different because like the history is different with East and West Germany.
But you see similar tendencies when it comes to the electorate of the AfD. So
and so then like, okay, I can go. Then my job is to say, okay, the factory's shut down and everyone's pissed off, and so they started voting for the far right. That's not wrong, but like let's try to get into a little bit more. And then you start to look at why were they voting for the French Communist Party? Well, because their parents did and their grandparents did. And there were these very extensive social organizations that the French Communist Party set up in the 1920s, and they were very local, and they organized dances on the weekends and unemployment offices, and they helped people when they were down on their luck, and they were in every town, and it so created this culture that people were raised in, and they identified with the French Communist Party. And then as the French Communist Party died out, as communism died out, and as sort of neoliberalism took over, all those organizations, they dissipated essentially, and so suddenly you have basically a kind of cultural and civic. You mentioned this before, but cultural and civic vacuum. And so were these people, working class people, were they naturally like left-wing voters? No, a lot of them were socially conservative. They also might have had views on race and gender and sex and that kind of thing that many of us would find objectionable, but they voted left because it was a cultural, it was a cultural institution that sort of kept them and their identity attached to this party, and that's all gone. And so now in a vacuum, they get angry and they feel these emotions. Okay, I'm going to vote for the National Front because they're the only ones who are feeling my pain, so to speak. And so, granted, I've been working on this for my book, so I've had the luxury of time to kind of dig into this one particular place and its history going back to even to the 1930s, but really those changes started to happen in the 70s and 80s. But that's a very particular example. I hope I answered your question.
Very well, please.
May I, another example, when I was a correspondent in DC and we were in the middle of the first election campaign in 2015, I met a female soldier close to Orlando who did local campaigning for Donald Trump. And I visited her on her ranch. She had like 140 cattle and was a classic Southerner conservative. And I wrote a piece about her, but really tried to stay away from judging her, but I just profiled her. And I decided she was so interesting that I should stay in contact with her and her husband, who was a three-time Purple Heart Vietnam veteran, and they were unbelievably conservative, unbelievably insulting against gay people, black people, and so on. But still, I really hold back, not to judge them, writing one piece and then like trash them, but visited them all 2 to 4 years. And last time I spoke to them this summer, and it's incredibly helpful to see. I just ask them how they feel, how life is going, what the circumstances are, how they see on political changes, how they perceive Donald Trump, how they see J.D. Vance, and so on. And for me, it's incredibly helpful not just to approach them once and get away with like the instant impressions from a day, but from 8 years or even 10 years. For me, it's probably the best indicator how the Trump base, the MAGA movement, is evolving over time, and they definitely feel they've won for a long time now. So in between, it was like, oh, Biden, oh, that really hurt, or the pandemic, oh, it's ridiculous. So I had to accompany them in the middle of the pandemic into a bar in Florida, and no masks, nothing at all, and it really felt at that time where we didn't know how Corona is going to play out, like a suicide mission. But being the only one in the room with a mask would have singled me out immediately. So I went in and put off my mask, and it was just the risk of that night. But what's really striking is now they feel like they made it, they won. And this is not only for one election cycle, but this is going to last for many, many years. This is just getting this feeling is super valuable for me to have an understanding how to portray the country.
A few last questions from me. Audience, please ready your own. We'll turn to you in a few moments. But I wanted to finish by asking about a set of challenges that I think are particular to the topic of tonight, reporting the far right, right? How do journalists report among these movements, supporters, and so on, when there's a kind of intrinsic conflict between journalists, the media, and these movements, right? To many of these movements, us on stage, the institutions we represent certainly, are the enemy. There's a kind of hostile, skeptical, if not hostile, relationship there, and that's and not just to the media, but in a way to the notion of a certain kind of objective, fact-based universe. I mean, at least, especially if we look at the realm of science, MAHA, a kind of subset of MAGA in the U.S., Robert Kennedy Jr., or the Querdenken movement in Germany, something I know less about, but I think perhaps belongs in this general topic as well, when you have a kind of just hostility to, at least as has been understood for some time, the kind of medical scientific establishment, and that gets us pretty close to just an idea of kind of what's a fact, what's kind of objective reality. So how do you both, either of you can answer this, whoever is moved to do so first, navigate this particular question when you're writing about movements, maybe on an individual level? Holger, this story, it sounds like you have quite nice relations with this couple right in Florida. So that's one way of kind of solving it. It's just on a human scale. When you get down to that kind of scale, somehow humanity takes over. Maybe it's harder when you have a crowd of people yelling at, reporters, or the media in general works on this one-on-one level. But so how do you break through this relationship or kind of setup that is often the case ahead of time when these movements look at you and your institutions with this skepticism, if not hostility?
I look at it more from a systematic standpoint or viewpoint, because I think there's a certain strategy to perceive the media as you said, the enemy of the people. Kellyanne Conway, I think in the first Trump administration, they did a very effective job in destroying the credibility of the media. When you look how the Pentagon basically expelled all real journalists, and now brought in all the influencers and followers, the alt-right media sphere. This is exactly where they want to go. Basically, it's the concept is to get rid of independent journalism, which is critical of the powerful. So they discredit journalists, Donald Trump sues the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CBS, ABC, and so on. So that's a constant strategy of destroying independent journalism. And I think we definitely need to stand our ground. defend our positions, but it also means we need to be very smart what kind of stories we are chasing, what kind of stories we are picking and pursuing, and if we pursue them, if we make that decision, we must be even more precise than we must be in general. There is no room for mistakes. We must weigh our words. Times are over where you can like oversell a story or over jazz the wording. I would always advocate for tuning the tone down a little bit in doubt, because I think the story really needs to stand for itself. It needs to defend itself, because the backlash is so sincere. So that is basically my concept: being more smart, but hold your ground and not retreating.
Right, but what does hold your ground mean exactly? Because what I'm thinking of here is movements and their supporters, their views, in this case regarding the media, or this kind of realm of just kind of objective facts that we thought we understood or shared, but turns out to no longer be the case. Those views on an individual level are heartfelt, they're genuine, they're kind of worth, I think, as we've discussed for the past hour, understanding in some way. But yet they sort of challenge or potentially contradict the very project that you're engaged in, right? And so just how, on a repertorial level, maybe Holger, you can talk if this came up in your conversations at all with this couple in Florida, like how do you get past that? You sort of want to genuinely understand what makes them tick, including their skepticism or hostility to the very act that you're engaged in. So how do you kind of get around that, or how do you solve that? Think about navigating that in your own work.
That's a complex question. I'm not sure if there's this one answer. What I in person, for example, am doing, I regularly go to right-wing rallies just to get an understanding who's demonstrating on the streets, who's marching, what kind of cultural habits they show, just to decipher what's going on. And if we speak to those people, I think it would be naive to come with a concept of like convincing them or debunking them. So I would always try to stay away from the activists who just want to agitate, and I try to show the people that do not come with an concept of ideology, but who are more like followers or so. So it's very hard to say it in general, but making smart decisions, smart calls, what kind of stories you are chasing. I think that's key.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree. That's a difficult question, and I think once again it depends who you're talking to and what position they are in. I'm a Midwesterner myself, and so I sometimes, to a fault, my approach is like I think people want to be treated with respect, and I find not always. I also go to AFD rallies sometimes, and sometimes people just they don't want to talk to you, and fine, that's fine. I have no problem with that. A lot of times people just want to be. I'm some foreign journalist working for the New York Times. Like, they don't want to be treated dismissively. They want you to take them seriously, and I think that's that's reasonable. I think that if somebody's going to, give you their time and speak to you, you should treat them respectfully and take them seriously. That being said, when it comes to, I'll talk to anybody and I'll have a discussion with them. When it comes to, deciding how I'm going to put my story together, then afterwards, once again, it comes back to this question of like, if somebody's like spouting conspiracy theories and saying, that COVID was, I don't know what the theory was. It was like lasered in by something about lasers in the sky. I don't know. But like all these sort of conspiracy theories, is it important for me to quote them on that? I mean,
but what if that?
Really.
But what if that is essential to their conception? What if that in some way, finds an outlet in their political views and the way they vote? I mean, that's intrinsic to how they see the world.
So then I can try to get at what their political views are and why they're voting that way. But do I actually need to cite them saying that like the source of COVID was like some laser beams from, I don't remember what it was exactly. So I think you can be judicious in the way, I mean, that's part of your judgment as a journalist is, what about this is actually going to lead me somewhere useful, and what about this is just repeating things that that are just not useful. And then I think you also have to. This goes back to your question, who you're talking to, and I I haven't reported so much on the kind of like hard right, like, sort of paramilitary things that we're getting into in the States now with like the Proud Boys and that kind of thing. That's like a different question as well, because I think you have to be aware of when people are trying to manipulate you. I mean, that's another thing. Sometimes these people who supposedly hate the liberal media and hate the mainstream press and hate the institutions, and I agree with you, they completely want to destroy any kind of objective press, but they also, it's like this love-hate relationship where they hate it, but they also want to be in the New York Times, that's also this dream of sort of legitimizing him, that sort of thing. So, depending on who you're talking to, you have to be really sort of aware of how people are trying to, you might be trying to use them or to get certain things out of them, but they're sometimes trying to use you as well. And I think I don't have like a simple answer for that, but just these are dynamics that one has to be careful of.
May I add one example, Josh? Because you mentioned COVID or Corona deniers. I think what's also important is to make sure that we are not a political party as journalists. We hold our ground as independent journalists, but we are not partisan. And just because Trump and the far right never believed in COVID and always said it's coming from a Chinese lab, shouldn't stop us reporting about that if there's credible evidence. And we found at Die Zeit, I in person as an author of that story, last winter, that the German intelligence agency, the BND, is deeply convinced and found significant evidence that the coronavirus indeed came from a Chinese lab in Wuhan. And it led to an interesting situation because we felt that this is like repeating the narrative of the far right and basically like repeating Trump's saying, like you remember the Wuhan virus and so on. Is this a reason why we shouldn't report about that? No, it's not. It's definitely a journalist's job to write that story if you have enough evidence. It's a question of how you write it. So we put enough context into it, and we distanced ourselves from Tom's saying at the time, which basically came without any kind of evidence. But I think it is important not to make the mistake to make a decision to be in this camp or in that camp and to be a partisan political party, yes or no.
Yeah, I mean, here I've had the luxury of being the moderator all evening and getting to ask the questions and not answer them. But I'm very sympathetic to a journalism that essentially, and this maybe sounds provocative, but I do ultimately believe it, that kind of doesn't care about the impact. I mean, the kind of very specific accountability, watchdog journalism you were talking about at the beginning, Holger, maybe that's something different. But in general, like, is this useful? Does this kind of buttress a narrative? Does it help one side? Does it hurt one side? I just really genuinely don't care. And I think that's perhaps the only way you can operate. Otherwise, you kind of immediately get lost. I mean, you'll sort of be trapped in the labyrinth with no way out if you start to think about those kinds of implications. And
I think sort of being automatically dismissive is also not, like, that's also sort of journalistic misconduct in a way. Like, I'm just thinking about, there have been all these statistics cited recently about how, like, child sex trafficking is an issue that people on the far right in the United States are very, very like obsessed with and very worried about it and that sort of thing. And so then sometimes you read these explanations like, oh, why is the far right, like, why are they so obsessed with child sex trafficking? It's because women, whenever there are increases in women's equality and then there's a moral panic and that sort of thing, it's like, well, actually, maybe they're really concerned about child sex trafficking because, as it turns out, there are a number of high-profile trials for that specific issue happening right now. And for us to just sort of dismiss it as like, oh, it's for this moral panic or that moral panic, I think, that's also... people have legitimate concerns for real reasons. And I think, yeah, that we have to also not dismiss, not dismiss everything automatically.
Mm-hmm. This really will be the last question from me, which is about how, not just as individuals, but as institutions, we can not just cover these movements, but kind of coexist with them in a civic way, right? And I think all in our own ways, Die Zeit, New York Times, The New Yorker, and maybe here, I'll put this question to you, Elisabeth, because I think The New York Times, which I don't mean to suggest you represent in some way on stage, but you have a bit more insight there. The New Yorker and Die Zeit, long before the rise of these movements, had kind of particular, were kind of put in a certain, ideological box, fairly or not, but they were kind of seen, they had a voice that allowed a bit more kind of point of view to emerge. But the New York Times was really seen as a kind of institution, the paper of record, and all the rest, a kind of arbiter of the truth in America for a long time. All of our institutions have lost this kind of universal truth-telling power or role, legitimacy, basically. No longer seen as neutral arbiters, seen as in some way partisan, in some way biased, ideologically driven, and so on. Whether that's true or not, it kind of doesn't matter. What my question here is based just on the fact that large segments of society see the name of our publications and immediately don't trust what is published there. Is that a problem? Is that a problem, Elisabeth, who I don't mean to suggest is the representative in Berlin tonight of the New York Times, but is that a problem that, for example, it would be hard, if not impossible, to imagine a Trump MAGA supporter getting her daily news from the New York Times? Is that an issue we should care about?
Absolutely. And I think it's not just the New York Times, but I think it's also like a chicken and an egg issue, because it's more a question of like institutional trust in the media being an institution amongst many. And I just saw a statistic the other day from like a Pew poll from last year that showed that the media was the least trusted institution in the United States, below Congress, mind you, which is like pretty low. So this is like an overall, I agree with you that the media does not have this kind of consensus status anymore, and I think that is not only a huge problem, but like maybe even like the problem, because institutions are not they're not inclusive anymore. They're not representative. I'm not placing the blame. I'm just saying that this is the effect, that they're not inclusive. They're not representative. People don't see themselves in these institutions, and therefore they don't trust them. So yes, I think that. Is it a problem that MAGA voters don't get their news from the New York Times, or not that they can't, won't get their news from the New York Times? Yes, but probably this sort of issue of institutional trust is what like turned them into MAGA voters in the first place. And I think that those are much deeper social and like economic class issues in terms of who it is that works in these institutions and who it is that doesn't work in these institutions, and I think that is a huge problem for the media and also for like all institutions.
Right, but the polarization spiral works in both ways. Maybe Holger is someone who has a kind of bigger view of the newsroom and perhaps even its business operations can speak to this, which is in the case of the New York Times. We talked about this, the infamous Nazi story, the Ohio Nazi from 2017. The backlash to that story about don't humanize him. This is a white nationalist with a dangerous ideology. He shouldn't be portrayed in this kind of soft, understanding, empathetic way. A lot of that came from New York Times subscribers, and the business of the New York Times now is a very different business than it was a generation ago. When you rely on the financial support and, in a way, kind of approval or continued enthusiasm of your subscribers, you're beholden to them in a very different way, and so you have to listen. If you piss off your subscribers, that's a kind of dangerous. Okay, here and there you can afford to do it, but in terms of kind of the overall worldview you offer every day, you do inevitably drift in the direction of offering the product that people paying for the product want to have. Does that not happen inevitably, Holger?
I would first like to make two corrections. I think there was never something like neutral journalism. I think journalism, by definition, is not neutral because it's written and chased by people with certain views. And
all I meant though is I'm old enough, just barely, to remember that you had plenty of, let's say, George W. Bush voters who read the New York Times, that was the paper they read every morning, and that's how they got their news in the early 2000s.
I think George W. Bush readers or people who like him would probably still read the New York Times. I think the Trump voters changed a lot. So I think that's important to know that there is no neutral journalism. Journalism always has been kind of like partisan. Also in the 70s and 80s in Germany, it always was a question: do you tend more to the CDU or more to the SPD or so? And in the US, in a similar way, more Republican or more Democratic. Second, I think this has a lot to do with social media, and this genie is out of the bottle. So the times are just over where you can be like the trusted source for everything. There's no way back to that. And having said that, I think it's wrong to define your newsroom to be in one camp, as said before. But on the other hand, you also must see the New York Times has something like 11 million subscribers. So they are not just financially incredibly successful, but also the audience is as a record high. And if you ask about Die Zeit, same thing. We have like 650,000 subscribers around-ish. It's a historical height and outreach as well. So the narrative that the far right and critiques of the media are feeding that no one is reading journalism any longer, that's just flat wrong.
Well, it's possible, at least in the case of the New York Times, where kind of segregation, polarization by class, education, political beliefs, and so on, that doesn't mean it's not economically viable. Maybe, in fact, it's very viable. We see that in social media is another case where sorting, right, and kind of giving people what they want can actually be an incredibly promising or kind of a quite positive economic proposition. So the two are not in conflict.
Reaching along the aisle as long as possible, I think, is really of the essence. And as said with the example about the coronavirus, it gave me a deep satisfaction to see that our diehard reporting on the facts was quoted mainly by people who believe that corona was either never existed or came out of China. So people from the far right who had to quote the side because we did the reporting that their media didn't.
Great. Do you have a last quick comment before we turn to questions, Elisabeth?
I would just add that in the U.S., this issue, you also see it of course, in the television public broadcasting companies. Because I think, I read a statistic like somewhat recently in the last couple of years that despite all of the social media, newspapers, fragmentation, all these kinds of new media and that sort of thing, that most people in the United States still get their news from like the evening broadcast on CBS or on ABC or whatever that might be, and so we're sort of leaving television out of the picture here. I think I'm not a television journalist and I don't know anything about it, but of course there's a huge struggle over those institutions happening in the United States right now. I'm sure people here have been following that there was just at CBS News that there's a new editor-in-chief, which is somebody who left the New York Times because she complained that it was too far left and started her own news business, and then it was just bought by CBS, and now she's the head of news at CBS. And I think you can interpret that as an attempt. I don't know if it's a good attempt, and I don't know how it's going to work out, and I think there are a lot of criticisms to be made. But I think you can see that as an attempt to kind of make these adjustments to institutions that people feel are not working anymore for the reasons that you stated, and to try and create something that has a sort of, whether it's economically viable or not, has a broader appeal. And I just think that these are the kinds of adjustments that we're seeing, or attempts at adjustments. Whether or not that will work, I think that's really to be seen.
Let's turn to the audience for questions. We don't have too much time. In the interest of time and respect for the panelists and your other audience members who want to ask a question, please keep your question concise. And indeed make it a question. So introduce yourselves very quickly. Just say your name and ask your question. All right, there's one in the front here. I think we're waiting for microphones. Is that right? Yes.
What's up? My name's Camus. I have a question for you. We focused a lot, I think, on the American context, but I'm thinking about the German context, specifically with your journal, and I'm wondering how you historicize the rise of the right wing in Germany, especially when you look at right wing tendencies in neoliberal politics in Germany. Thinking specifically about the sort of like chronic and systemic racism within the German policing of left wing protests versus Nazi fascist demonstrations that occurred earlier this year, and sort of how you look at how the far right is not necessarily an outlier, but also is, you know, there's sort of these tendencies within neoliberal politics as well. I'm wondering how you report on that. Thanks.
That's a big question, which would probably require another evening. What really concerns me is that my understanding or my impression is that the AfD for a very long time was stigmatized and some kind of like outlier, and most parts of German society just didn't want to touch it. And then we saw that the followership creeped into the police apparatus and the legal apparatus, and I would say probably something like a year ago, from like last year or maybe 2 years ago, this stigma really like vanished and is gone, and now people really have no hesitation and no problem at all to openly associate themselves with the AfD, and that made the party a kind of like normal. I think the Brandmauer discussion still tries to preserve the old status, but the normalization of the party and the thinking behind it is really far advanced, and that, for me personally, that's a huge problem.
Let's go in the front row here.
Yeah, thank you very much for this discussion. I'm actually a journalist from France, and I was first interested in a more kind of very conceptual question, but we entered the whole idea about reporting about the far right, and I was really wondering what you meant by far right, which would be connected to the question I just heard, because I would totally agree with you, Mr. Stark, that far right is becoming a very complicated concept or category. You seem to all there seemed to be an assumption that far right were designating like voters from specific parties. So you were talking about Trump, about it's not Front National, but Rassemblement National and AfD. So that's really seeing it from the perspective of those voters. I was wondering whether this is so useful anymore. I mean, as you said, I mean, especially when we entered some politics, when not the voters, but the ideas those parties are actually putting forward are now becoming very, very mainstream. So you said on the one hand, people don't have any problem. That's the normalization of the party. That's one part of the story. But the other part of the story is we see more and more that those ideas are being have entered the mainstream discourse, and I would say even in France and in Germany, our governments, up to a point, right? I mean, and we've seen it not so long ago with the chancellor here, and we have Macron and some specific people in France that have been actually putting into practice ideas that Marine Le Pen are totally supporting. So my question would be, how do you deal with this? I mean, that's kind of
what happens when the far right, if that's a term that indeed makes any sense, which I agree, the answer to that might even be no. But are we still exoticizing or otherizing the far right when in fact it's just a mainstream part of our politics and society, and it's kind of here in a way that we pretend somehow that it's still this thing, this kind of acute, self-contained thing worthy of our journalistic study rather than just being the air we breathe?
Yeah, my question was, how do you deal with it, basically? How do you deal with this situation?
Well, I think you have to keep in mind that trajectory. Yes, I agree. It has become part of the mainstream by now in France, in Germany, in the United States, in many places. But that doesn't mean, first of all, that it's, okay, every government has like liberal and illiberal tendencies. So I'm not saying that all governments for the last, 50 years or whatever have all been perfectly liberal governments or that sort of thing. But clearly far right has migrated into the establishment. And it's trickier maybe in the United States because we only have a two-party system, right? But you can see that the Republican Party has been completely transformed in the last 10 years. Has it become a it's hard to, has it become a far-right party? I mean, it's very hard to, yeah, I agree, those labels.
We had to call the panel something.
I mean, you need some sort of a term for it. What Trump is doing to the Republican Party is not what the Republican Party was 10 or 20 years ago. And then if you look at certain things at what he's doing in terms of, immigration raids on the streets of, cities, sending in troops, refusing people entry into the United States because of things that they've said on Twitter, the shooting boats in the Caribbean, without knowing who's on them and killing. I mean, these are far, we have to qualify that somehow as being different and exceptional. Okay, yes, there were previous American administrations who did questionable things in foreign countries for sure. But this has been a regime change. So you need some way of acknowledging that, and maybe calling it far right is imperfect, but. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Maybe I didn't understand the question.
Right, when ideas that once maybe felt contained to a certain political camp that you could kind of isolate, put borders around and say, these people believe this, now it's just part of the political mainstream.
Well, in a way, you have a very interesting example these days with the Stadtbild debate and Friedrich Merz. I'm not going to say that this is far right, but it is super interesting because it's the attempt of the CDU to, in a way, reach out to the people who potentially vote or would vote for the AfD. So he tries to explore some kind of sentiments, and I think what the CDU needs to do is to reach out to those voters without copying the AfD style and the AfD phrasing, and this is it's a good example that they haven't found their footing yet, and probably the entire society hasn't yet. If someone would have found it, I think we would have seen already better results or better examples. So the conservatives try to get back parts of those voters, but if they copy the tone and the kind of messaging, they only fuel the anger, and they don't get anything back. But the AfD is going to be more strong if they refuse to go to that concept of a more conservative society or for conservative ressentiments. Then they probably lose as well. So I think this is a super complex and question where the answer isn't given yet.
I promised a question back in the corner here.
Hi, thanks so much for this inspiring debate. I was really interested in your take, Mr. Stark, that journalism these days needs to be able to defend itself against accusations. It needs to be solid in a way that it perhaps didn't have to be in the past. And I just wonder how this ties in your opinion, with the question of how much do we want to humanize, how much do we want to go into the human story of who these right-wing forces are. And I just wonder if, because this is how the discussion started, you were, I think, both of the opinion that these days it is particularly important to do solid reporting. I just wonder, what place do you think does the portrait, does the longer form report, does the essay have in this political climate as opposed to, let's say, 5 years ago? Has something changed here, do you think, in the role of journalism? Do we have to be, I'm not sure if I'm making this point very clear, but do we have to be even more precise in sticking to the facts now, or is the longer form story, the human story, perhaps even more important now? How do you see this in terms of what kind of journalism do we need to provide? Hopefully this was concise enough.
Again, there is no one answer to that. What I personally believe is that while we did like the portrait or profile of certain people in the past, it must be now more kind of like investigative profile, because as I mentioned with Gloria from Tono Taxis, they hide a lot, and I don't want to read just a nice, empathetic profile, but I want to have the background in addition to it. And given that that we're dealing with a force or dealing with a might that explicitly considers us to be the enemies, that is something that we have to take into account. Of course, we can still write our opinion pieces, our essays, but that probably is more like unifying the people who feel adversarial to the far right already. So I doubt that we're going to convince a lot of other readers on the other side of the aisle with that. But in general, I can't. There's no such answer like the one thing. For example, we did a story about the German delegation who was traveling to the to the Young Republicans gala dinner in New York 2 years ago, a dinner where Donald Trump was a guest speaker, and there was an AfD and a really right-wing delegation from Germany, and we found a picture where they were all sitting in black ties around a table. So we were just taking that picture and saying who's on that picture, how much did the table cost, what did they eat, and it turned out it was like 10,000 or so for the table, and a huge amount of money. And it turned out it was a neo-Nazi. Some people were neo-Nazis, others were members of the parliament from the AfD. So it was it was a melting pot of the far right, basically. And we just took the picture and then described what you can see on the picture. It's a new format. We found that more appropriate because you could see it in a nutshell, all in that picture.
In the corner here.
I am Magdi, I'm a journalist. My question regarding we kind of forget or ignored the influence of billionaires. You mentioned Weiss, who's now the editor-in-chief with CBS News. I feel like this the right wing build a kind of their own media, their own broadcasters during the few years ago, but now I feel that we are witnessing some kind of influence is getting into the traditional newspapers. How do you see that? And my second part about the MAGA movement in a political perspective. Now I feel there is this kind of division or kind of they feel that Trump foiled them, kind of disappointed them regarding to what happened, the attack on Iran, or as well Epstein files. How do you see this as well, this kind of development?
So you're talking about the sort of the changeover at the top of some of these media organizations in the U.S. I mean, I think this is something that you're seeing in a lot of countries that have had these sort of illiberal transformations, right? Where you get a figure into power who feels that the press is antagonistic toward them for all sorts of legitimate reasons, right? But then when they get back into power, this happens with Orban, this happens, I guess, I don't know, bringing Russia into this is maybe a different issue.
I have something to say, which I think
yeah, but so now they can make this public case that there's this press that's treating them unfairly, which is basically and we probably see that as being, them doing their jobs, but they can make this case for bringing the media to heel. And, I've covered Hungary, and so I think there's a tendency for American or for foreign journalists to look at like, oh, Orban took over the media in Hungary. And now we're sort of in a very different way, but we're sort of seeing the use of money and the use of lawsuits and the use of like regulatory principles to control who's in charge of these very large, very powerful, and becoming more powerful by the day because they're merging media organizations. So I'm not like I definitely see that as a sort of money, control, power, friendship, kind of oligarchic, circle that's closing in on. And as an American, you always think like, okay, America is such a kind of decentralized, chaotic. There's so many different states and networks, and it would be hard to kind of centralize control over something like that. But it kind of seems to be. Seems to be happening in an astonishing, not an astonishing way, but it's happening quickly. So yes, I think if that's what you were getting at, like I think that there is a kind of like buddy consolidation of control over these big media networks that's happening in the United States for sure. And then the other part of the question.
Can I just jump in on that first part?
Yeah.
Which I don't know what. Either of you, Holger or Elisabeth, whether you agree with this or kind of edit it in some way, but my sense of how the rise of a liberal regime works in practice, I'm thinking here of Russia, but I think Hungary also fits the model, and maybe what we're observing in the US is headed in that direction. It's not that independent journalistic institutions like the New York Times or something disappear. They remain. They're just no longer relevant. They no longer have the same role they once did in society. For example, an investigation into big top-level corruption might have, a generation ago, led to hearings in Congress, potentially even judicial processes, trials. Now they just kind of are swallowed up by the black hole of our kind of scattered attention economy and polarized society, and no one kind of cares. So the New York Times and its investigations continue. They just don't mean anything anymore. And I think that to me is the real story of how kind of contemporary illiberalism works. It's not that the New York Times is raided and put out of business. It continues to exist, but in this way that just kind of, the institution remains, but its civic and political function has dissipated, if not vanished.
That's true, but I think the New York Times is not the best example because it's the most prominent newspaper in the world, best equipped and funded. And I'm on the other side also, on the other hand, also convinced that the lawsuits have the sheer goal of, or sheer intention of putting that much pressure on the newsrooms and the executive presidents of the papers or the networks like CBS, that they, on the long run, stop doing that kind of reporting. If you look at the CBS 60 Minutes example, I mean, that was about this one interview that 60 Minutes conducted with Kamala Harris. And the result was that the producer or the chair of 60 Minutes resigned, and the network paid 16 million basically for nothing. And no reporter will dare to run such an interview again or to make an editorial decision like that again. So this constant pressure on those institutions is incredibly high. Yes, the New York Times of this world, they will remain, and a handful others as well, but you also see the impact on a day-to-day basis on other smaller or weaker news outlets.
We started a bit late, so maybe we have time for squeeze in one last question. Try and make it as quick as you can.
Yeah, this is easy. I just want to follow up. Why do you think this is that the New York Times articles are not as relevant as they used to be? I mean, you described it very well, but I don't understand why you think this is happening.
I think, as Holger said a moment ago, that would require a whole another panel that would begin right now, of which I actually wouldn't be the best or most competent expert to speak on it. But I think the reasons are myriad, from this kind of self-segregation, segmentation of audiences, a lack of kind of shared understanding of truth, or kind of institutions that are seen to be the arbiters of truth, like the New York Times, but also kind of broken, polarized political system. So there's no way for things like independent media to connect to the kind of formal political system hearings in Congress or the judicial system, and so on, the kind of mechanisms by which journalism was integrated into civic life. I don't want to say are completely broken, that sounds too definitive, but are certainly diminished. I also think, and here I will briefly share an experience from Russia to the extent it's relevant or not. I don't actually think that neither the United States nor Germany is kind of barreling towards a Putinist future. I think that that analogy is of very limited utility. But still, I remember talking to someone who runs the really only remaining independent sociological polling sociology center in Moscow, who continues to do focus groups, or this organization continues to do focus groups and polling after the invasion of Ukraine. And there was an interesting conversation the director of this institute relayed to me with a woman from a mid-sized city in Russia, asking her about where she got her information about the war and about kind of the world and politics more generally. And she was a supporter of the war. She was a supporter of the invasion, or at least kind of, let's say, a passive supporter. And she said, at this focus group, you know, if I got my news from, say, the BBC Russian service, I would probably think very differently, not just about this war, but about everything that's going on in my country. And that's why I don't watch the BBC Russian service. And I think in that particular aspect, that's not our future, that's kind of already our present. And that is, I don't know if it's the most important or powerful reason why, according to my thesis, which is not even universally agreed on in stage, and that's fine, but why something like the New York Times has lost something of the role it once played is for that reason. Because the New York Times is still doing its investigations, but if people are kind of subconsciously or consciously looking away, or there's not really much that brilliant, brave, talented journalists at the New York Times can do if people don't want that information. On that happy note, I will take my prerogative as moderator to end the panel with great thanks to Elisabeth and Holger. Wonderful evening, very interesting conversation. Thanks to you both, thanks to you all for coming, and hope to see you on November 11th with Andy Morantz.